The second form of privatization or private education is private funding, where the school may be government or could be a private school, could be a religious school, but the payment, the cost of education is borne or funded by private individuals rather than government subsidies. In other words, I may go to XYZ school, different students may be going to different schools, but it's not the family that pays, they can't afford it, but there is a group of individuals, a individual or some consortium that is willing to fund and provide for the fees for that particular institution. That is private, considered that way because the family is not paying and neither the government is paying. There is a third-party involvement that steps in to pay the cost of tuition, fees. Some may also pay for books and stationery and uniforms and other kinds of things. It depends to what level the individual or the group is willing to fund. Privatization may therefore mean that parents pay for schooling rather than the government via revenue or taxes. In developed countries where taxes are collected, a large chunk of those taxes go back into education. So I may not directly be paying for my students, for my children even, but because I pay taxes and taxes are deducted automatically at source, indirectly I am actually paying. So if you say I'm sending my children to a public school or a government school and I don't pay fees, but you are paying taxes. So indirectly, you are actually paying the fee. So you have to understand the subtle difference between paying the fee, free government education, and private education that costs much more, funded by a third party. Often, private schools are supported directly through tuition fees paid by students' families. But in many cases, both families and governments contribute funds in a cost-sharing approach. We've seen that in different countries, the amount of sharing of the burden between the government, the family, and other private individuals varies. In some countries, for private schools, there is no government funding. In some countries, there is some government funding. And in some countries, private schools just do not exist. All education is through public-centered schools and institutions. So, how do you bring about this balance? How much should the government contribute? How much should the family contribute? How much should one be dependent on a third-party contribution? All that depends on, of course, the number of children from a family that go to school, where the school is located, how many children can go to a school, what is the size of the school, what is the size of the classroom. A classroom that's made for 30 students cannot realistically accommodate 50. It would be nice to have 20 more students, but where do they sit? How do students move? What happens in an overcrowded classroom? So privatization is essential, but you have to look at the various forms under which it can exist. Public universities in the United States charge tuition fee, but these only cover approximately half of the total cost, the remainder being covered by government subsidies. As I said earlier, tertiary education is expensive, and the developed world, it is really way more expensive than it is in our part of the world. And so, to expect that all your tuition fees will be borne by the government is not. The families do have to pay a certain amount, half of it, 50%, and the other half then the government, or through taxes it can be picked up, or through other third-party private donations and grants it can be picked up. In the Republic of Korea, private education spending on schooling and on additional tutoring in subjects not covered in schools amounts to approximately the same total as that of government expenditure. In other words, in Korea, families spend about the same amount of money on their children that the government spends on those children in schools. So it's really like a 50-50. Half the burden is borne by the government, half is borne by the families. In many developing countries, Families must pay additional top-up fees to the local state-funded schools. The fees collected are just not enough, or the government grants are just not enough, and some amount of money, some contribution has to come in from the families and the parents. I strongly believe when everything is free and taken for granted, people do not take even education seriously. Some contribution, whether it's 50 rupees or 100 rupees, must be collected in order for parents to understand that it is partly even their responsibility to make sure that their children receive good education.